Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ORF. Welcome to this special session that we are hosting to launch this special edition of ORF Global Policy series, this special edition on global nuclear security. And we have a very distinguished panel for a panel discussion, and we have the two editors with us today here. This is a very interesting volume in the sense that it tackles a very, very contemporary and important subject in the international security agenda. And it is also very forward-looking in its approach, laying out some very pragmatic policy recommendations as to what policymakers can do in trying to tackle the challenge of nuclear security that emanates both from the state and non-state levels. Let me invite the two editors to make their introductory remarks before we formally launch the volume, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion. Dr. Alad Wagemaker, one of the editors, will go first, and followed by Dr. Rajeshwari Rajgopalan.
It's a pity, right? Because I believe I had some nice, good graphics. I showed it Raji, and anyway. So it's about 2.5 years ago that we started together with ORF on this project. It has been a long journey. We developed the idea of that nuclear security needs more attention. But how to do this? We had this nuclear security summits, 4 of them, and it basically went off the agenda. And we felt, especially Raji, me, as well as Dominic Kulling, who was the head of the political affairs and number 2 in the embassy, that we had to do something with it. And then we developed some kind of idea, and we had our ambassador involved in it, who was immediately fully with us, and said, "Yeah, we have to do this." So what we decided upon is, let's have 4 scientists from the Netherlands and 4 scientists from India with us, and let's have them write individually a paper on various areas, various aspects of nuclear terrorism, which is by itself a very complicated subject. And so they wrote, each of them wrote a nice article, and then after that we put them together in The Hague, and there they discussed all papers with all the information they got back, the discussions. They fine-tuned their articles, and then our work started as editors. Me, as I was a year ago, I was still the defense attaché here. Left India, of course. Raji flying around the world, me staying at the other end of the world. It was quite a process, but we managed, and finally the report is there. But back to nuclear security, especially nuclear terrorism, because this report is about nuclear terrorism. And if you talk nuclear terrorism, you talk about nightmare scenarios. Think about some kind of a dirty nuclear bomb explodes inside Delhi or any other major city. It's going to be a nightmare, really a nightmare. And this issue isn't, oh, there we go. So we're talking about these kinds of scenarios, and of course this is your big bomb. But if we go to the issue by itself, it's not new. It's not, in a way it's new, but it's not new. Think about, especially this book from Graham Allison. It has been launched in 2005. And especially this book got a lot of attention because it sounded alarm about the clear and present danger of nuclear terrorism. But it also had 2 contradictory positions. One is that at that time, on the path they were going, some kind of a nuclear terrorist attack was inevitable. On the other hand, what they said is nuclear terrorism is preventable by an agenda of actions that are feasible and affordable. But how to do this? Now, the issue of nuclear terrorism came already in the presidential elections of 2004. And at that time, it was Kerry against Bush. And it's also the time that there was this nuclear threat initiative that was already going. It's also 2004 something. And especially this initiative led to a concerted effort to the visibility of the issue. And then it was taken forward in these presidential elections. If there's something that these two agreed upon, Kerry and Bush, was that nuclear terrorism is the single most serious threat to the national security of the US. They both agreed on it. And by that, it was on the agenda, big time. Then later on, we'll have Bush and Obama. And again, the problem, the issue of nuclear security was in the presidential elections. And they, what they said at that time is, let's say about 2004, 2005, 2006, it was about 10% chance of a nuclear terrorist attack. But they estimated as well that by 2030, 2040, maybe 2050, let's say in a couple of decades, it would be very much likely, if not 100%, that this would happen. And both of them, again, agreed that something had to be done. And there, comes this statement in the presidential elections. And especially Obama took this forward. Now, it's very nice to have these kinds of statements, but what do you do with it? If you address terrorism, you address a very complicated issue. It's difficult to understand what terrorism is. I mean, we understand what terrorism is, but what is it really all about? And especially if you talk nuclear terrorism, what is it all about? And then how to put this forward in some kind of a policy. Now you will get a gap. As a military, I can say intelligence, they come all with nightmare scenarios, and this creates a gap between what the intelligence is saying on the one hand, and the other hand, what the political analysis is of the same issue. So how serious is it? Very serious quite often by intelligence services. And then when you talk about politics, then it's, they're talking about, okay, it's serious, but it's not that serious because it will cost a lot of effort, it will cost a lot of money. How important is it? So it creates a gap. But what to do with it? Well, some people talk about the so-called Sherlock Holmes approach. And what you do with this approach is that he has this framework. Motive, means, and opportunity to identify actors. But this is not enough for nuclear terrorism. Because I believe it's motive, means, opportunity, as well as organizational capability. Because this is more complicated than just fabricating a simple bomb and explode yourself, and explode it somewhere, or explode yourself, whatever. So the O, where initially Sherlock Holmes talks about motive, means, and opportunity, MMO. Now I believe we have to talk about MMOO. So this also shows the weak spot of terrorists, the weak spot of nuclear terrorism, because this is the Achilles heel. Because if they are organized, this can happen. If you can prevent that they can organize themselves, then this will, let's put it in a way, I can't say it won't happen, but it will be more difficult. It will be extremely difficult. It's just a matter of putting more effort in it. Now, the good thing is that for us that it's still controllable. On the other hand, modern life, especially internet, provides many ways for terrorists to fabricate a dirty bomb, because internet provides access to chemicals, especially on black markets, chemicals like fentanyl and pathogens, but also can provide the core of nuclear bombs. And on the web, there is accessible information about how to create or how to fabricate an elementary bomb. So this makes it difficult. And yes, I believe we need to worry, which is basically also the idea behind the book. it needs to stay on the agenda, nuclear terrorism, because this is something that one day will happen to us. So if we look at it, there have been several initiatives, especially by the Russians and Americans, up to, let's say, 2014. This is one of the bigger initiatives. But the problem is that by the time it was 2014 and all these various initiatives were very nicely carrying forward, the invasion of the Ukraine happened by the Russians. And then as a kind of yeah, how would you say this? A way to punish the Russians, the Americans pulled the plug from various initiatives. This one, however, stayed. That's a good news. And this one has been going since 2006. This is an initiative by Putin and Bush, and it encourages states to share information, share good practices, etc., etc. Especially this one is very important, and this one they kept. So for continuing the awareness of nuclear security, nuclear terrorism, this one is very important. But this is at a bilateral level. Also, what has been started at the multilateral level is these nuclear security summits. And focus is on the mind of the leaders of these countries that participate. And what it actually does is it has to take the threat of nuclear terrorism seriously, but also how to take steps to address it, how to get it on the political agenda in the various countries. This NSS process, these 4 NSS conferences, they were a huge success, huge success. The problem is the success wasn't carried forward, which is so important in this whole thing. And why is it important? In 1991, just after the Soviet Union broke up, there were 52 states with nuclear weapons. And in 2009, it's 38, and 2018, so today, it's 24. And these are the 24, sorry for the resolution, I couldn't find a better one. It's 24 countries which have nuclear weapons on their territory. It's not necessarily a nuclear weapon state, but they have nuclear weapons on their territories. Yeah, sorry, materials, yeah, sorry. Now the thing is, whether this possession of nuclear materials is controllable. Well, there are in the various countries splinter groups that could have access to radioactive materials, especially highly enriched uranium, and which is a bigger problem is the lower enriched uranium, which has a dual use purpose. Often used in nuclear reactors, but also used in medical services. And this can be used nowadays also in nuclear bombs. It's not that powerful, but it can create this nuclear fallout. And then on top of it, it can create major problems also only when a little bit of this material is spread. Think about these two. It's close to home. This all of us know. And look at it. What a little bit of nuclear material can do. On top of it, if you think about this problem, think also about Al-Qaeda and their training manuals. In their training manuals, it is said that nuclear power plants are the best targets to install massive fear amongst the population. And this became true in 2015. In 2015, there was a terrorist attack in Brussels airport in Belgium. And they investigated these terrorists, and they found out that these terrorists had special attention for a nuclear research facility just outside Brussels. And then, especially the fear was actually there, that imagine what would have happened if this had been under attack, this facility. Brussels is maybe not as big as Delhi. I believe it's a little bit more than 1 million persons living out there. But the trouble would be huge. So what do we actually address with nuclear security? A very complex issue. And here you see what in how many fields it is somehow, nuclear security. And then we'll come back to the book again. So we wanted to carry forward the spirit of NSS. We want to keep nuclear security on the agenda. But how to understand it? So Raji and I decided that we need a book which basically covers most aspects of nuclear terrorism, the issue of nuclear terrorism. So these authors, I believe, they did an excellent job. I'm really proud of it. And I'm really proud that we could share all this knowledge with you people, and hopefully to many more people, and it carries the spirit forward. As we were thinking about the title, we were also thinking about the subtitle. And one of the subtitles was that nuclear terrorism, the ultimate preventable catastrophe, which was maybe a little bit too ambitious. So we changed that. But what we try to establish with this book is it needs continuous effort, it needs continuous engagement, it needs to be continuously on the agenda. And hopefully this book can help with that. Raji, up to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And Alad has made my task a lot simpler, because I think he has covered the vast expanse of the subject of nuclear security, and both primarily looking at from the nuclear terrorism perspective and how that feeds into the increasingly the global debates on this subject. And I think first, let me thank everyone for coming here to ORF. And I think the nearly a full house on Thursday morning, despite the fact that ORF has had a couple of different book launches recently in the last in this week itself. But that also speaks to the importance of the subject. So thank you for everyone to making time and being here this morning. So like Alad said, I think this has been a long journey. We initially conceptualized the whole idea of this project at more than 2 years ago. Sitting in the conference room on the second floor is when we can sort of, this is a subject that needs further attention, closer look, and what needs to be done to keep up the momentum, the global momentum, the attention that it has, essentially that has been driven through the NSS process, the Nuclear Security Summit process. So that's how we got into it, and I must thank the Dutch, the ambassador, and the two colleagues, Alad, of course, and Ms. Dominic Cooling, who was, again, instrumental in kind of supporting this project wholeheartedly. And we had a workshop with this. So this project has 8 authors, totally 8 authors, 4 Indian authors and 4 Dutch authors. Given the leadership that the Netherlands has taken on the subject again, that's when we decided, I think it makes sense for India has its own concerns, and India has an important role in this regard. And given the leadership role that both India and the Netherlands has played, it felt it was a natural thing for us to step to kind of partner with the Dutch embassy in this regard, the Dutch government, to work on this subject. So we have primarily, it's not a book focused on India's nuclear security approach, because I think that's been talked about. We at ORF itself, we have brought out 2 editions of the nuclear security report, which is looking at India specifically. So we did not want to repeat that particular process, although we do come up with a series of smaller publications updating on the nuclear security process and policies and measures that India has been continuously making progress with. But I think there are 2 chapters, one by Dr. Rashmi Khasi, looking at the India's contribution to the global nuclear security efforts, and I think that's an important contribution. Given that India is not situated in a benign neighborhood, this has remained an important subject for India much before it became, it caught the global attention. The global attention became important only in the context, first after the Cold War, end of the Cold War, but it became much more serious. The issue gained a lot more criticality after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. But India, where given its location and given the kind of neighborhood that we are in, I think we have been focused on this particular aspect for a much longer time. Maybe we haven't spelt it out in as much on the open domain, but that is not to suggest that India does not have a policy or that India does not take this issue give its due importance. Second, we have an important chapter on the Indian contribution. Again, that is specifically looking at Dr. Rajiv Nayan has a chapter, has an essay looking at the role of export controls. And I think that's a subject that has not been usually talked about and written about, at least in the context of the nuclear security. So that is an important contribution. He has tracked the different export control mechanisms and regimes that come into play in strengthening both global nuclear security, but also to suggest as to how that has improved India's own practices and policy measures in this regard. So those are the two India-related essays that we have in this book. But the rest of the subjects we have a sort of somewhat eclectic mix of essays. We have three Dutch scholars who have written on one on the using a theoretical framework to analyze the global nuclear security issues and to see whether bilateralism is a much better approach to a global effort, what is much more feasible and much more sort of realistic to achieve the goals of nuclear security. So that's an interesting take on the subject and a very different idea to a kind of way of approaching this particular issue. A second essay by a Dutch scholar looks at how terrorism and such other phenomena can give way to state conflicts, and how that could also end up with a possible nuclear fallout, or the potential for a nuclear conflict is escalated because of the terrorists who create state crises and so on and so forth. Dr. Nicola Bladel, in that chapter, he has looked at South Asia, but also he has looked at the Eurasian context and the Middle Eastern or the West Asian context and how these issues play out. Allard and I have a broad introduction on the subject where we talk about how do we keep up the momentum and some of the political issues in this particular regard. I have a chapter where I do look at the larger global layout and what are the kind of mechanisms that have been at play, what are the different institutions and policy mechanisms, including the legal measures. And I think even though generally we don't see the major powers coming together to explain, kind of agree upon a set of issues today, it has become extremely contentious, and developing consensus among the major powers has been a serious issue on any new global security. But I think one exception that we have by and large seen in the recent years is the nuclear security. And the convention on, for instance, CPPNM, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, is a solid instrument in this regard, because physical protection of nuclear materials is one of the key aspects that when we look at the whole nuclear security. So CPPNM and also the Nuclear Security Summit process itself brought about, even though it was a sort of informal process, but I think it also helped sort of expand the scope of discussions, but also the scope of different stakeholders. It was no more just limited to the state actors who are part of the conversations in this regard, because the Nuclear Security Summit, along with that, you also had an industry summit, but also a civil experts and NGO summit. So it expanded the number of stakeholders involved in the process, and thereby coming out with new innovative ideas and possible ways of looking at this whole issue and how that might be looked at. Now that the NSS process, there have been 4 nuclear security summits, but it has come to an end, and therefore the whole idea, there is, of course, under the IAEA, there is the process is continuing at some level, but I think the Nuclear Security Summit provide a very refreshing perspective on focusing on the nuclear security issues. So I was, my kind of essay in that sense, focus primarily looking at what are the possible means to strengthen nuclear security and keep up the momentum that has been created. So one of the first things that I looked at is for instance, the need to look at codifying standards and regulations across the board. And I think there are global standards and regulations covering both civilian and military nuclear materials through of course, the International Convention on Nuclear Security. I think it's nuclear safety issues. I think there has been one convention, but I think if you are able to codify some of these guidelines and regulations through a convention on nuclear security, I think that might be. But I think there have been arguments to both the advantages and the negatives to having such a convention on nuclear security issues. That's something debatable, and we have an excellent panel to discuss some of these issues in the next few minutes. Second is, of course, like I said, they expand the number of nuclear security stakeholders. And I think the NSS, again, provided a good framework for that. And how do we continue with that? And but I would, again, underline and say the fact that nuclear security is a global problem. It cannot be tackled at the regional level, and it should not be sort of brought down to the regional level. There are regional institutions that deal with some of these issues, but those regional platforms must be, for instance, institutions of excellence and so on and so forth. These must be used in order to create global conversations rather than limited to regional efforts and so on and so forth. And especially in the Asian context where things are muddied by a lot of the geopolitical issues and historical political issues, I think it'll be a futile exercise that if we limit and the role of regional organizations to talk about nuclear security in a very regional context. So use the regional institutions, but expand the conversations and keep them at a global level. And India has also been taking some leadership role in this regard. We have been doing that, and I think that process needs to be continued in a sense. When we talk about nuclear security, I think two important factors that issues that come into play are, one is the nuclear security culture, and I think that needs to be instilled a lot more in detail. How do we do that, and whether it is in the civil domain or the weapon domain, that has had a most important role in tackling insider threats, and I think that's something that that should be emphasized time and again. And also, this would mean that you need to constantly update the kind of manuals that you have within civil nuclear power plants or even within the weapon premises, where security culture is given a lot more prominence, and therefore the accompanying processes such as the insider threat identification processes, human reliability program, or the personal reliability program, as we call it, those things, those processes can be updated and strengthened from time and again, in a sense. Another important issue is to look at the instituting better accounting and auditing mechanisms and practices, because I think there have been very few even minor issues, whether it's in the Indian case or even globally when you talk about it. But even the few lapses that may have happened, and we need to have a better set of issues as to how we are tackled with them. Have a record of incidents and how those issues either were mitigated or handled in case of an accident and so on and so forth. So it does serve as a useful reference to avoid such kind of pitfalls in the future. So again, that also goes to instituting better auditing mechanisms or accounting mechanisms of the nuclear and radiological material across the country and across the different countries. So again, that's another process. But I think one of the larger set of issues that needs to be tackled at a global level is the strengthening the IAEA. The role of the IAEA, even Indian government has talked about as to how IAEA remains a central pillar when it comes to global nuclear security. But again, the human, whether it's human resources or even the financial resources, have been somewhat wanting in the case of IAEA to do the series of what the extra responsibilities that is being mandated upon IAEA. So if IAEA has to function its role as an efficient kind of central agency, I think the amount of resources that get pulled in from different countries, different IAEA member states, that has to step up in the coming years. I think there are different ways when we look at standardization of rules and regulations. The IAEA has a set of rules, but I think different countries have also adopted somewhat different practices. One is to say that these are the minimum set of standards that you need to have in play, but at the same time, it is left to the power plant operator or the military operator to determine how that particular goal is achieved. So that's been by and large the Indian approach. But I think even so, I think that it might be useful to have a set of absolutely minimal set of conditions or the processes that must be sort of much more mandatory, and other practices can be evolved and can be determined by the individual power plant operators and so on and so forth. But a few of the conditions and processes must be made mandatory across the board for all the plant operators and so on and so forth. That could possibly, in a way to kind of strengthen further nuclear security practices in a sense. The last two set of issues is one is the strengthening contingency response measures. So we are, of course, looking at every single country is putting in stronger measures, more efficient measures to avoid a nuclear catastrophe, whether it is in the form of a sort of a RDD or a suitcase bomb or even a radiological attack and so on and so forth. But should something happen, what are the kind of measures that we have in place to respond to a sort of a contingency, to respond to an event? How strong is that? How effective is that mechanism? Because you are bringing in multiple security agencies to come into play to respond to that calamity. So how efficient is that? So increase the number, for instance, one of the things is to increase the number of interagency exercises in a sense. There are multiple security agencies involved in this exercise, in this process, and each of these agencies do these simulation exercises to see what are the different kind of scenarios that might play out in the nuclear security context. But I think involving all the different security agencies, those exercises involving all the agencies must be, I think, increased, must be strengthened a little bit more. The frequency could be better, because for any country, this is going to be a huge problem. But for a country like India with a huge density population and the kind of chaotic urban spaces that we have, this is going to be even more challenging. So I think even as we have been doing that, but I think the numbers could go up where we involve multiple security agencies that can be taken up. Lastly, like I said, the regional centers of excellence, those are important measures, those are important platforms, but I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that we should not get bogged down to regional focus to these nuclear security issues. These are global problems, and therefore tackle them at a global level than so I think I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to hear your thoughts and comments, and we're certainly looking forward to the next panel discussion that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji, and thank you, Arad. I think before we move forward to the panel discussion, can I ask the ambassador to formally release?
Okay, thank you
Yeah,
so much.
should we?
Pictures to be taken.
Yeah.
Okay, Arad, how we do it?
Ja.
Gaan we niet drie kom je hier
Yeah,
staan?
yeah.
Dan gaan we over. So, congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay. Now I have two.
Now comes the interesting part where you can hear criticisms. We have three excellent panelists with us for this panel discussion. I think one of them is an author, right?
That's right, Professor Raja Raman.
So yes, Professor Raja Raman is a contributor to this volume, but the other two are impartial, so they can feel whatever they want, what they really feel about the conclusions and I think the recommendations. So with that, let me first invite Professor Raja Raman to make his presentation and to talk about his chapter, perhaps, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To remind me of my points. So first, I want to express my appreciation to Raji and to members of the Netherlands Embassy for conceptualizing and organizing this symposium last year at The Hague that culminated eventually in the volume that is being released today. I haven't seen the volume yet, and I hope my article is there somewhere. Now, in the 10-15 minutes I have, I think what I can do usefully is to give an overall background to put this entire business of nuclear materials in perspective. So my aim is not to criticize the book, was obviously I'm an author in it. So let me just give this background. I think it's needed. First thing is, why are fissile materials important? Although there are several sophisticated components that go into making a nuclear bomb, the most difficult thing to obtain surreptitiously is the fissile material needed for the weapon. All the electronics and the various other technically difficult components are relatively easy to get hold of surreptitiously. Whereas the fissile material which forms the fuel of the weapons, whether it's plutonium or highly enriched uranium, is not available in nature and has to be artificially manufactured. And this artificial manufacturing is done either in a reactor or in thousands of gas centrifuges. Either way, the facility you need for this will be huge. Reactors take big buildings, have all kinds of pipes and things sticking out of them. And as far as centrifuges are concerned, there are tens of thousands of them which are housed in giant halls. So these facilities cannot be unobtrusively hidden in a basement or in a garage, whereas the remaining components of the bomb, if you have the experts, can be made that way. Therefore, terrorist groups cannot hope to manufacture their own plutonium. They can, if they have smart enough people with them, they can manufacture the remaining components, but not the plutonium or the HEU without being discovered. In fact, even a nation state, namely Iran, could not surreptitiously do it. It was caught in the process. So the only hope for terrorists is to pilfer some of the existing stock of some nation state. That is why securing them is so important. Now, how big is the problem? What is the size of the beast? Well, at the height of the Cold War, there were about 2,000 tons of HEU in the world, highly enriched uranium, which is one of the two things that make the bomb, either that or plutonium. Now the 20,000 tons can make 80,000 bombs, 80,000 nuclear warheads. There are also 500 tons of plutonium, which can make 100,000 bombs. So that is the amount of material that was there at the height of the Cold War. Now, these 2,000 tons and 500 tons and so on has to be viewed in the context of the fact that it takes only 5 kilograms of plutonium. You can hold it in your hand. If it's a piece of newspaper, you can hold it without even hurting yourself in your hand. It's very small. Or even HEU, which takes only 25 kilograms. So all this is tiny number compared to the 2,000 tons and 1,000 tons of these materials that we have lying around in the world. So the global stock of fissile material of these several thousand tons has to be therefore protected against pilferage to an accuracy of 1 in 100,000. So you can't even miss 5 kilograms of plutonium or 25 kilograms of HEU compared to the thousands of tons. So a very obvious prerequisite for ensuring this is to have a very precise inventory of how much each country has. If you don't even know that, you'll never miss 25 kilograms if it went here or there. Many years ago, with this kind of problem in mind, some friends and I formed an international panel on fissile materials, 2006, with the idea is to address, as scientists, fissile material issues of all kinds. At that time, the inventory that we got from our friends and colleagues from around the country, we had members from every country, every nuclear country. The global inventory then was 1,600 tons, come down a bit because the rest were put into bombs since that time. Okay. And most of this material is with the two Cold War powers. In particular, there's an uncertainty at that time of plus or minus 300 tons, in spite of our best efforts. Why did this uncertainty come from? Because the Russians themselves didn't know how much fissile materials they had beyond this accuracy of plus or minus 300 tons. And remember, 300 tons can make 300 times 40 weapons. So that was the state of nuclear material security and the importance that was placed during the Cold War. People didn't even know what was being manufactured where, especially in the USSR. Now, that is the size of the beast. Now, one important ingredient in improving the security of materials is to reduce their quantities. And the first major step was taken by the HEU agreement between the US and USSR and Russia, actually, in 1993. It called for Russia downblending 500 tons of HEU into LEU. That means highly enriched uranium, you make it less highly enriched so that it's not weapon usable, but can still be used in reactors and so on. And the deal was that, and Nunn and Lugar had a lot to do with all this, senators, Russia would downblend 500 tons of HEU at about 30 tons per year and supply it to the US. The US would then use it for their civilian use. Since the program converts bomb material into electricity, it's acquired the nickname of megatons to megawatts and has been one of the most successful things that have happened in the area of nuclear materials security. Now that reduced the stocks, but even now there are some 1,400 tons of these materials available. So there's plenty to worry about. Incidentally, we must distinguish, and that's sort of important in this discussion, between fissile materials and all radiological materials. This often gets confused, sometimes even in sophisticated discussions. Anything that's radioactive is a radiological material. You've got lots of it lying around everywhere in hospitals, university labs, everywhere, little amounts. Whereas fissile materials are those that can be used to make a nuclear explosion. You can't make with radiological materials bombs. They can spread radioactivity. To that extent, they are dangerous. Whereas fissile materials, which are only basically 2 plutonium and HEU, are needed for making bombs. So one must distinguish between these, partly because fissile materials are obviously thousands of times more dangerous than radiological materials. Radiological materials can at worst be used in what is called a dirty bomb. A dirty bomb, which is a suitcase full of bandages, junk you get of radiological sort from around the country, wherever you are, put them along with a conventional explosion and explode the conventional explosion. The explosive power is the same as that of your normal explosion. Only thing is it spreads some radiological material, and depending on how much you put in that suitcase, you spread some. It is bad in lots of ways. I can go into a long discussion of that, but that will take us upside. But it's nowhere nearly as dangerous as a nuclear weapon explosion in terms of casualties or in terms of physical damage. I would say it's about 100,000 times less serious. So I'll concentrate on fissile materials. Part of what happened was that during the second nuclear summit in Korea, Fukushima had just happened before that. So there was enormous emphasis suddenly on radiological materials and their security, and it got bunched in along with fissile materials, which I think was a mistake. Although radiological materials are important in their own way, the way by which you protect them is completely different. They're distributed in different ways. That's a whole different issue. So I will be talking mostly about fissile materials and leave others to discuss radiological issues. Now, the problem, as I said, US and Russia had the largest stocks, but many non-nuclear weapon states, as well as smaller nuclear weapon states, all have large quantities of HEU. And the non-nuclear weapon states between them have, large number of them, have what is called significant quantities of HEU, which is enough to cause danger, enough to make a bomb. And even countries that don't possess fissile materials at all also have to watch out because they'll be used as transit centers to go from place A to place B. Therefore, the process of accounting for and watching out for fissile materials and ensuring their security cannot be limited just to nuclear weapon states or even to the non-nuclear weapon states that have material, but in fact have to be instituted everywhere in the world because we don't know what is transiting through where. So any number of major international agreements have come up in convention. They've already been mentioned, and my colleagues will, I'm sure, talk more about it. We look to Ambassador Sood to enlighten us more on the authoritative situation. The biggest step would have been the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, FMCT, or Fissile Material. The C is used by many people in many ways, but the Fissile Materials Treaty, in any case, it has failed to get off the ground at the Conference of Disarmaments in recent years, largely due to the obduracy of Pakistan. And attempts to negotiate such a treaty outside the CT have also not succeeded. And again, I look to Rakesh to tell us the latest situation on that. But I want to conclude by saying just a couple of more things. No matter how much you barricade a door containing a tank of water, some water will always come out through the bottom. It's unavoidable. So similarly, no matter how much security measures you take, sooner or later, the possibility of something leaking out cannot be ruled out. But the chances of it can be lowered by adopting some measures nationwide. First thing is every country must have a precise inventory of its nuclear materials and must have a precise set of measures to protect it. And as I said, since this material can be transported and transferred from one country to another, cooperation between different countries is needed. And for this purpose, President Obama did a great service by setting in motion the set of 4 biennial nuclear security summits to sidelines many of us have gone. And these were very, very successful in a certain limited sense. Politically, it was a great success because 47 nations participated in the first one, and I believe 38 were represented by heads of government, which is the largest collection of heads of governments in Washington, I believe, since the time of the League of Nations. So, and this large collection of people unanimously endorsed at the highest levels the importance of nuclear material security and of the importance of strengthening it. As a result of the voluntary steps that were taken at these 4 summits, as was mentioned earlier by my Dutch colleague, out of the 32 countries which had HEU stocks of more than a kilogram, after the summit only 24 remain now. 24 is still not a small number, but they are there. Why do these other countries have such material? Not because they want to make bombs necessarily, because they are needed for research reactors. They are needed for making medical molybdenum and other products. So that is why they had borrowed these materials from countries, and after the summits, attempts are being made to get them to come back. Now it is, the most important thing is that beyond voluntary efforts, the summits unfortunately could not take even a step further. They could not, for instance, ask countries to evaluate their nuclear materials quantities and do an audit and tell the world how much they have. This was considered to be would be totally unacceptable and would have destroyed the harmony and convivial unanimity of those summits, so it was not even touched. So the way things remain now is that every country says, look, I know what I'm doing. I'm taking certain measures. I can't tell you what they are. And some of them do and some of them don't. And let me show you that we are being careful. There's every reason to believe that because it's the interest of every country to protect its radiological material. But if countries have to cooperate, it would help in the longer run if some of the procedures are more transparently available to others. It is true that there is a conflict between security and transparency. One is always endangering the other. So a fine balance has to be struck between security and transparency without endangering the security or revealing classified information. This can be done. And specifically, India has made now public much more information than was available earlier on its security measures. And examples of sources of this information are Rajeshwari's pioneering study and its updates, and also a booklet that the Ministry of External Affairs released called Nuclear Security in India. It's a nice little booklet, contains all the steps that Indians have taken. So it's important to not only take the steps, but tell the world what steps you're saying, not only to give them confidence, but and it gives you a platform for cooperating with one another. So we are doing that in India, and on that positive note, I'll conclude.
Clear case of oversight, Professor Raja Raman. Initially, I started focusing on the Indian authors, and I talk about because there were 2 chapters which focused on the Indian approach. That was Rashmi Khasi and Dr. Rajiv Nair. But clearly, the first chapter on the book on this volume is Professor Dr. Raja Raman, looking at nuclear security and providing a global overview and not just focusing on India. And thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Can I now invite Dr. Sethi from Center for Air Power Studies to comment on the report?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of you. I do want to start by thanking the ORF, not just for inviting me to be a part of this rather heavy panel, but also for bringing the focus on nuclear security once again. It is a subject whose import has certainly not diminished, even if the Nuclear Security Summit process has stopped for the last 2 years. And the urgency of the challenge, I don't think, is missed by anyone. And I'm completely with the intention of the book, which, as you said, Allard, is to keep nuclear security and the issues of nuclear terrorism on the agenda. Since I did not have a copy of the book with me, so my remarks are rather generic. But I'm glad that I don't think they seem to be overlapping much with what Raji said in terms of the content of the book as such. I have some points about the recommendations that you've made, and I will try and elaborate them. But largely, I've always maintained that nuclear security, much like nuclear safety, is more a journey than a destination. As Professor Raja Raman said, even in the best of tanks, water could leak. So nuclear security can never be a point which is perfect, just like nuclear deterrence can never be a perfect situation. And if it's a journey, then we have to constantly keep checking as to whether we are on the right track when we are going towards nuclear security. In theory, one could well argue today that we are on some kind of a right track, considering that we have today a mosaic of international mechanisms that focus on nuclear security. We have international treaties, we've got cooperation agreements between nations, we had the Nuclear Security Summit process. We even have something like 24 centers of excellence, many of which are focused on looking at nuclear security. So while the Nuclear Security Summit process did have an impact in terms of raising awareness on this issue at the highest level, so you had at the summit level political leaders giving the highest amount of attention to nuclear security issues. Membership of the treaties went up as a result of the Nuclear Security Summit process because countries came with what they called gift baskets to the summit process. And national legislations have gone up. Enforcement procedures are much more than what they were earlier. They've even been tweaked to match up to international benchmarks. And there are today in place 5 action plans at various levels that are looking at nuclear security. So you have it at the United Nations, the IAEA, the Global Partnership Against Spread of WMD at the Interpol and at the GCINT, which was flagged by Allard. Yet, I think challenges remain, and I want to basically flag 5 of them. Firstly, lack of good relations amongst the biggest stakeholders in this particular issue, which I think becomes a huge stumbling block when it comes to moving on issues which have global dimensions, since it's certainly not a national issue and it's not just a regional issue, it's a global issue. You need to have the best of the stakeholders invested in this process together in order to keep the focus on the issue. Different nations obviously have different priorities at different points in time. But what happens is if there is a consensus amongst the big stakeholders, the big powers, then the sense of urgency filters down to lower levels as well. Because if they are not together on this, as we saw in the case of the nuclear security, the last nuclear security summit when Russia said that for us, the nuclear security issue is closed. We've done all that we could do at the multilateral level, and they never came to the Washington summit. We've seen in the past that when big powers were together on some issues, those issues did get resolved. And one good example of this is in the 1970s when they came together on the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in order to deal with the problem of possible proliferation of nuclear weapons. We saw that again in 1995 when the NPT came up for its review and extension. Again, the big powers were together and had a consensus between themselves in order to push non-proliferation by giving an unconditional, indefinite extension to the NPT. We saw this consensus once again in 2010 when President Obama brought up the issue of nuclear security, and he got 50-odd countries to come together in the first nuclear security summit process. But by 2014, when Crimea happened and Russia and US fell apart on many political issues, we saw the focus on nuclear security also get diluted as a result of that. So the basic point that I'm making is that for nuclear security to remain on the radar, it's important that big powers remain connected. And if the political relationship today between US, Russia, US, China is what it is, then it becomes very difficult to get other countries also to accept the urgency that is needed for a global concern like nuclear security. If the countries with the biggest stockpiles are sounding more belligerent today, if they're going more towards nuclear modernization today, then obviously they're reticent on nuclear information sharing. And it can't be expected that the other countries would then want to do nuclear information sharing and contribute to the process of nuclear security. The second challenge that I think comes from the first one is this, from this first challenge of lack of focus of the big stakeholders, is that it leads to lack of uniformity in recognition of the threat itself. So not everybody thinks nuclear security is a huge challenge that needs to be invested in. And that leads to less amount of rigor in the implementation of the instruments that you have. So there are smaller countries, which for instance don't have nuclear power reactors, who feel, why should we be looking at this process when the big powers are not even together on this particular thing? Why should we be a part of international mechanisms? Why should we be doing what they call burdensome reporting on some of the international mechanisms which, which demand such kind of reporting? For instance, the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 asks countries to submit national reports to them, to the committee. And most of the smaller countries, and I've heard it, for instance, from even Indonesia or Philippines, who think, we don't have nuclear material here, why should we be doing this kind of a thing? And if you don't have that big power commitment, which is pushing it down the smaller countries, it becomes very difficult to keep the global focus on nuclear security. The third major challenge, I think, comes from the need to balance national sovereignty with international responsibility. Since both these dimensions, national sovereignty and international responsibility, impinge on nuclear security, both of them are important. But what happens is too much international oversight, perhaps on an issue that Raji raised about material accounting. If there's too much international oversight, this could be perceived as intrusive by the countries. But if there's too little, then it leads to laxity in or complacency in what the kind of processes that you're applying. So therefore, this this rather difficult balance to strike between the two. Professor Raja Ram said, countries say, we are doing it, but do we need to tell you about what we are doing? Who are you to ask us about what our processes are? This is my national sovereignty issue. But at the same time, there are certain international commitments that you must live up to, because it's not just raising confidence in your systems, but it's also raising confidence in the fact that others are also learning and remaining invested in that process. This is not a, my security is also impinging on another country's security, just as his laxity in command and control could impinge on mine. So therefore, you have to be invested together in this particular process, which leads to this whole issue. And in the current climate, which is so filled up with mistrust and a lack of good political relations between nations, it becomes a bigger problem. The fourth challenge remains the lack of punishment for non-compliance. And since none of the instruments, they're all voluntary, they're not legally binding, they have no penalty mechanisms in them, which makes it very difficult for countries then to take these issues seriously, if they are not particularly, putting it as a priority in their own list of actions. In fact, I find a bigger problem in if you're sharing information on material accounting, and there is actually a loss of material that happens, would a country want to disclose that, or would it want to keep quiet on it? Because you fear what could be the international backlash on that particular issue. So this is something, I think, which is very difficult to resolve in terms of how much would you want to tell or keep hidden. And the fifth and the last challenge that I think arises from the fact that after Fukushima, which led to the dissipation of the sense of nuclear renaissance, which was beginning to be felt across the world on nuclear energy, the nuclear market today is once again a buyer's market. So the countries are more wanting to sell the nuclear industry, where nuclear industry is very important in some of the countries. They want to sweeten the deals that they are making on nuclear energy or nuclear reactors to country, rather than enforcing nuclear security impositions on them on various kinds. So given that the predominant sellers in today's nuclear industry market are Russia and China, both of which are not very well known for their imposition of strong mechanisms for selling their reactors, if they are selling them to countries which don't have regulatory environments which are very strong, which have unstable political systems, then it becomes a double whammy on nuclear security, because you're also selling it to countries which don't themselves have very high stakedom in nuclear security. So lack of insistence on high level of a security culture and practices anywhere could lead to a disaster somewhere, whose impact would not just be national, it would really be global. So let me end with a few suggestions that I have for improvement. Firstly, I think to turn the situation around, nuclear security has to be perceived as a common goal by everyone, and especially by the major stakeholders. Now, how do we bring that about is difficult unless the political situation becomes better. And I'm hoping that we are not waiting for a trigger in terms of an act of nuclear terrorism before we begin to realize that we are all equally responsible for this. The second, I think there are 4 types of sharing that could be helpful. One is sharing on technologies for detection. We do have expensive, radiation monitoring equipment at various ports. Some countries can afford them and some can't. Countries like India and China might be in a position to mass manufacture them and provide them to different countries at lower costs and make it an incentive for them to have those kinds of technologies available to them. Scanners at ports, decontamination techniques or materials, medical countermeasures, these are all things that must be easily available for countries to be incentivized to put them up where necessary. Secondly, sharing of advances in nuclear forensics. Since this would help in prevention of nuclear terrorism through deterrence by the threat of punishment. If you're able to attribute an act of nuclear terrorism, then there are greater chances of your being able to deter such an act from taking place. Thirdly, sharing of best practices and experiences in enforcement. Training of security guards. Raji mentioned physical security is so important. So training and these are issues on which sharing of information should be fairly easy. On the making of personnel reliability programs, how do different countries make them? What tools do you need for software tools that you use for data mining, for storage, for easy retrieval of information from the personnel reliability programs? All of this, I think, is important. India's Nuclear Security Center, the GCNEP, is a platform that could be used for building and disseminating some such tools. Lastly, on the sharing aspect, I think threat perceptions and mitigation techniques between nuclear industry and government are very important, because the industry must not feel that things are being thrust upon them without their understanding why it's happening. And sometimes it might be more interesting that things come up or processes come up from the industry itself as to how you could enforce nuclear security in a better manner. So lastly, all I want to say is that attention-raising events and efforts will be periodically needed in order to keep the focus on nuclear security. Some of the international mechanisms like ICSANT or CPPNM, whenever they come up for review meetings, some such opportunities will arise. The IAEA, of course, has its ministerial meetings, but more such opportunities will have to be created through platforms like what has been presented to us by ORF today. And I think India, too, at the global level, must continue to keep this issue in focus, since we are, as she said, not in a benign environment. Nuclear terrorism is something that directly affects us, considering that we are in a region where both of these intersect with each other. Nuclear material and terrorism intersect very closely in our neighborhood, and therefore it's in our interest to keep this issue alive. And very lastly, I think what we need to do is neither exaggerate nor minimize the threat. Some of the pictures that you showed were of the mushroom cloud and not so much of nuclear terrorism. But because if you go into the alarmist picture, then I think you get paralyzed into inaction to think that nothing can be done. And if you get into the other side where you think it's not a threat, you minimize the threat to a great extent, then you become very lax and complacent about it. So you have to follow the middle path, I think, in terms of keeping this balance between alarmism and minimism. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
I think today he was trying out a sound and light show today, but otherwise the publication is quite balanced.
Lastly, can I invite Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who is a distinguished fellow at ORF, but of course has been very closely involved with Indian nuclear policy. Rakesh.
Thank you, Harsh. And let me also congratulate Raji and Allard for this publication on global nuclear security. I think we've had two excellent presentations, and I particularly liked what Manpreet said about finding a balance in terms of, the alarmism coupled with the sense of minimalism, as if everything is fine. And also the fact that ultimately we are looking at, if we are looking at nuclear threats, then nuclear security is actually a small subset of that threat. And the magnitude of how small it is was something that Professor Raja Raman, I think, brought out very clearly when he said that, all right, if we are looking at, if we take out the radiation dispersal devices or dirty bombs, and we look at the two fissile materials, namely high-enriched uranium and plutonium, and as Dr. Raja Raman said, he said that perhaps the global stockpile today would be in the ballpark of about 1,400 tons, ballpark? Okay. So 1,400 tons is what exists. Most of it exists with the states that possess nuclear weapons. About 15 tons, out of this 1,400, about 15 tons is what exists with non-nuclear weapon states for research purposes, producing radiation devices and things like that. So out of the balance, out of 1,400, if you take out 15, which is with non-nuclear weapon states, that means you are left with something like 1,385 tons, which is with the nuclear weapon states. And out of this 1,385 tons, 1,300 or thereabouts is in the military fuel cycle, which means that none of the international instruments cover it. The instruments that Raji and Manpreet talked about, the instruments like Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials and so on, they don't cover the military stocks. And so you are left with what? You're left with 85 tons out of a total of 1,400 tons, roughly, that we are trying to deal with. I'm not saying that's a small quantity, because as it was brought out, I mean, 25 kilos is all that is needed to produce a device. And out of the 1,300, nearly 1,200 is with US and Russia, incidentally. So, as we look at, I think it gives you an idea of the dimensions of the problem that we are dealing with. With plutonium, we have roughly about 500 tons of plutonium in the world, out of which, because plutonium was thought of as a useful fuel to have, about 53 tons, about 10%, namely, is with non-nuclear weapon states. And even the nuclear weapon states maintain about certain stocks of civilian plutonium, which they say is meant for civilian use in nuclear power reactors and so on, which is about 218 tons. And so therefore it leaves us with a military stockpile of about 230 tons. A military stockpile with all the nuclear weapon states. Out of the 230, 220 are with US and Russia, with all other countries accounting for less than 10 tons of military stocks of plutonium. So it shows where the problem is, or to identify actually the source of the problem that we are trying to deal with. And I think if we go back to the nuclear security summits, which began in 2010, there is a political rationale behind it. In 2009, I think it was 2009 that President Obama made his famous Prague speech, where he talked of possible global zero. And coming from the US, it was a very, very significant policy announcement, But then it led to a backlash within his own country, among US military allies, and so on. And I think President Obama realized that at least on the nuclear agenda, there was nothing that he could do which would take him forward towards the kind of goals he had outlined in his speech in Prague. And eventually, people looked around. Well, he didn't want to give up the nuclear agenda because he had established with his speech a certain profile for it. And so therefore, he came up with the US came up with the idea of a nuclear security summit. Very quickly, it was also clear that this was something which would not be something on which anything could be negotiated. And so therefore, it limited itself to what was called the gift baskets and voluntary steps and things like that. Yes, what it did was it certainly focused attention, and as Manpreet pointed out, it increased adherence to certain multilateral treaties and conventions. But ultimately, and the issue remained center stage as long as the US president continued, as long as Obama continued as the US president, the last summit being in 2016. Now, obviously, it was more his personal involvement that was able to attract widespread high-level attendance. But the absence of any negotiated outcome was clearly felt, and I think it was quite clear that the process of summitry could not be carried forward in the absence of a charismatic political leader. And that's the reality. Now, the fact that nuclear security, because I think, as Manpreet said very aptly, that it's not a destination. I mean, it's a journey. And so therefore, there are aspects to nuclear security that need to be kept in mind. But we need to understand that for the moment, A, we are looking at a very, very small fraction of the amount of fissile materials that exist. And B, that what we are seeing are essentially voluntary measures, and that's the extent of the cooperation. Voluntary measures for improving security of nuclear materials and facilities in terms of sharing of best practices. There is no, and it is voluntary, so there is nothing which is compelling. There is no disclosures, as was pointed out. The international physicist panel on fissile materials that Dr. Raja Raman referred to is based on estimates, is based on best estimates, as it were, by qualified physicists, because most nuclear weapon states do not disclose. I mean, ultimately, to be able to, I think it is common sense to understand that if we want to have security of fissile materials, then the first thing we need to know is how much has been produced and where is it stored. And once we know that, then we can start looking at, but since the amount of fissile material stockpiles that have been produced are not declared, therefore locations, particularly when where the military fuel cycles are involved, will not be disclosed. Therefore, all you are left with is voluntary best practices. And which is where I think it is important, as Raji mentioned, and as was also highlighted by the other panelists, that if we have to therefore, faced with these drawbacks, if we still have to look at nuclear security and try to make progress within the limited sphere by encouraging countries to adopt best practices, we have to emphasize that it is a global public good. And if we continue to do so, if we continue to do the opposite, which is what a couple of chapters attempt to do, by limiting it to the bilateral context, then I'm afraid we are actually being inconsistent with the very objective with which we started out. I mean, we cannot have a situation where you think that in today's, particularly in today's time, to look at bilaterals as the way forward to deal with nuclear security, to me, flies in the face of reality completely. Because today's reality, if you look at it, is of an Asian continent or an Asia Pacific, which is a more crowded geopolitical space with multiple nuclear countries. And one of the problems is this deliberate misreading of what constituted the Cold War balance. The Cold War balance was, in a sense, like a tug of war, where you have two teams, both about equally placed, and each pulling, and therefore you move forward by a couple of inches on one side and then move forward on the other side by a couple of inches. Now, what happens when one of the team suddenly collapses? It also unbalances the other team. The other team also collapses. And I think what we are therefore seeing is a lack of the balance which we, many nuclear theorists often describe as nuclear deterrence as a means of stability. I think we fail to understand that nuclear deterrence was a period of stability because it was underwritten by the notion of parity between two nuclear superpowers. Today, even though US and Russia still account for the larger majority of nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, in a more crowded geopolitical space, absents the issue of bipolarity. What we are facing is greater and greater asymmetry, both in doctrinal terms of countries that have nuclear weapons, and secondly, in terms of sizes and quality of arsenals. The Chinese arsenal is not of the same quality as, let's say, the US arsenal, or the North Korean arsenal is certainly not of the same quality as the Chinese arsenal. But nonetheless, some kind of deterrence gets into play. And I think the notion of finding bilateralism or bilateral dyads as the way forward in this increasingly complex period that we are looking at, where relations between major powers are marred by lack of trust, I think is something which we have to be very careful about and look upon nuclear security and strengthening nuclear security as a global public good and focus on that particular aspect. Last, I would just say that I think when the fissile material cutoff treaty, since Dr. Raja Raman talked about it, when the idea of fissile material cutoff treaty came up, it was seen as a progressive step, and the idea was very simple, the Shannon mandate. It looked at precisely this, cutting off of fissile material production for military purposes. That means countries that were producing plutonium or highly enriched uranium for military purposes would declare that they had stopped, and those particular facilities would end up getting mothballed. Now, since what was then left was fissile material production, which for civilian purposes, which would be allowed, for example, in our case, for the breeder reactor, or in Japan's case, because they have stockpiled significant stocks of plutonium, that could take place under safeguards, which means that there would be no production of fissile materials outside of safeguards. That would be the logic. But then Pakistan wanted to expand its plutonium stockpile. At that time, they weren't producing plutonium, so they wanted to get onto the plutonium route as well. And so they changed single-handedly the definition of a fissile material cutoff treaty to a fissile material treaty, which meant that they wanted to ban, knowing full well that that was not going to happen, to ban all production of fissile materials. And that is where the CD has remained at an impasse for more than 2 decades, with none of the countries being able to call Pakistan's bluff. And therefore, I think that, and I don't think, therefore, there is any likelihood or hope that we are going to see even the beginning of negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty. And which brings me back to the issue of nuclear security, because ultimately we have to get a sense of balance in terms of the nature and the size of the problem that we have to deal with, because I think with that, it's like having the right size of a spanner to unlock a nut. I mean, if you take one that is too small or one that is too big, it won't do the job. Thank you.
Put this up for discussion. I think I'll give you the editors a chance to comment on some things if you want. Should I just open it up?
Maybe we can come back. And,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, first is the recommendation. If we have another nuclear security summit, last one was in 2016, and we involved the regional centers of excellence, I feel it should be somewhere in South Asia in view of all that Rakesh has spelled out. We had it last in Seoul, but if you want more awareness here in the volatile region, we should have something over here. My question to my good friend Allard, this MMOO, according to me, the weakest link was that organizational capability, because if they don't have the organization, then they can't go about it. But the problem is, and when you talk to a political problem, say India and Pakistan, how do we get Pakistan to cooperate? I mean, India can't do it. We can't get them to cooperate even in normal terrorism. So this nuclear terrorism makes it even difficult. For India, Pakistan, we are sharing nuclear installations every January. But we haven't gone beyond that. I don't know if you have any ideas. And secondly, everybody's talked about mandatory. And then Rakesh said that the military stockpile is not part of it, which is the major. So I want to know, especially in case of USA and China, who will adjudicate the adjudicator? Nobody can do anything about these two big boys. So we have a big problem. I mean, it's and over here again, penalties. Manpreet, you talked of punishment. How do you ensure a penalty if I know that I'm not going to be penalized? I'm going to do what I want to do, despite the threat being in my country also. So I think, in my view, some more thinking on this needs to be done in the regional context. Thank you.
Just a short point. You see, the nuclear security threat comes from the perpetrators. If the perpetrators were not there, there would be no such need. So far, all the publications I have read and the talks I have attended, I think 99% of the time we are talking about the threat from a single religious denomination, Al-Qaeda and affiliates. Time may have come that we start looking at others. I will refer, it's there in one book, to the drug mafias. They're not interested in bursting a bomb over New York, but if they're able to buy at phenomenal sums from countries that are weak, whose economy is weaker, fissile material, then these drug mafias provide immunity for themselves. I'm giving one example. There are others. I think it's high time we look at the other side of the problem as well. Thank you. Vinod Sagal.
At the back, yeah.
Hello. Good afternoon, sir. Panelists here have talked about the dangers if violent non-state actors have access to quote-unquote nuclear weapons or the risk involved in possession of huge nuclear stockpiles by few world powers. But I want to know what's your take on the situation with the Iranian nuclear deal. We can see a contrast here. There is no global consensus over it, and the difference between the standpoints of the current US administration and IAEA and rest of the Europe. So it's a rather political question. So what
Can
do
you
think?
introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. I'm Varun Sharma. I'm a student of public administration. Just
Thank you. So we will take the first round, okay?
I have. Good.
We'll come back. We'll come back.
Well, thank you very much for a very complex question. Raji and I write in the introductory chapter of the book about nuclear security as a Faustian bargain, which basically says that the likelihood of war decreases by greatly increasing the cost of war. However, if you talk about nuclear terrorism, it's a complex Faustian bargain, which makes it, basically explains the difficulty addressing this, the subject. Now, with the organizational capability I was talking about, I primarily mean that although it might seem simple to create a nuclear security, nuclear terrorist attack, it's actually a very complex one because you need so many different parts to come together at the right moment. And since this is difficult, the likelihood is still not that likely, although likely. So if you can do something about the organizational capacity of terrorist organizations, then the likelihood theoretically should decrease. But it remains a problem because these kinds of organizations, which are somewhere in the dark right now, especially organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, somewhere in the dark, you don't know exactly what they're doing. You know that they would, for instance, like to create what they say is an American Hiroshima. But looking at, as has been said by the panelists in various ways, most people right now live in Asia. So if you talk about likelihood or devastation in for instance, a megacity, most megacities are in Asia. It could also very well happen here, or in, better say, this part of the world. You're also talking, and also this addresses also the last question. It's actually about state-sponsored terrorism, how to control this. And I believe this is the real issue. We're talking about essentially fragile states who want to have more power on the world level. And they do this in, well, let's call it a dirty way. How to control this? How to control these kinds of states? It's difficult. And this also addresses, in a similar way, this, the question of the first and the last speaker is how to control, how to address, how to maybe punish if you don't act according what has been agreed upon. That's complicated. It all depends on dedication, and I believe, and it has been said several times here today, what has President Obama done with his dedication to set up this NSS process, this NSS attitude. It's all voluntary, and yeah, hopefully, fingers crossed, that the essential parts are not getting into hands of terrorists. We have to do our utmost, but we can't make sure that it doesn't happen. Haji.
Give a lot of the questions to three expert panelists out here, but let me quickly just run over some of the points that came even from our panelists. I think one of the areas that I want to talk about is for instance, the getting smaller countries and others interested, and that also ties into the question that Janal asked about how do you deal with a problem, a nuclear terrorism issue emanating from Pakistan, for instance. I think there is very little that one can do in that sense. And therefore, I think the more important aspect that we can focus on our attention is on strengthening our own measures, whether in terms of detection, monitoring of especially the entry points into the country. At every single entry point, do we have monitoring mechanisms? I think strengthening our own internal measures would be a lot more important and a lot more effective in dealing with a cross-border issue from Pakistan and kind of things. But on having said that, I would not agree with you on the point of having more regional kind of a focus. I think, again, I would go back to the point that you need to educate the smaller countries and others who may not be as interested and inclined to focus their limited resources on this subject. But I think focusing and limiting the effort just at the regional level is not a good thing. Like I think Valpreet and I have again talked about it, regional centers of excellence, all of those institutions, platforms use them, but create global conversations and to kind of, and I think NSS in that sense was a great platform. Like I said, even countries that were not generally inclined had the interest to come to Washington, D.C. or go to the other summit. I have a photo up with a charismatic political leader like Obama. So it did work, and that charm did work in a sense, personal. Today, of course, you don't have a charming president sitting in the White House. So there's a.
I think she's charming.
That's yeah, we can get into that debate in a sense. So that I think so. Therefore, I would say regional. Educating the region, and even at the regional levels, are important. But use the regional institutions to create global conversations and platform initiatives. The other aspect I agree that Russia did not come at the last summit, but even then, I think nuclear security is by and large one area there where you have seen a lot more support and agreement among the major powers, because even those states who have sponsored terrorism and so on and so forth believe that this is a global cost that they need to be party to and in agreement with, because everybody wants to focus their attention on terrorism. So, it's a non-state actors that we are talking about. It's not us that we are talking about. We are all good, and we are the good guys who are trying to deal with this problem of global terrorism coming from non-state actors and so on and so forth. So even those states like Pakistan and others have been party to the nuclear security summit process, and because they believed the problem came from somewhere else, they did not believe that they were part of the problem also, in a sense. So in a sense, I think global nuclear security is one issue where you have seen, by and large, somewhat sort of support in a sense. No penalty. Okay, I'm all for having a legally binding mechanism, but I think the problem is also again, look at our neighborhood. You have had legally binding measures, but there have been violations of the commitments. No penalty on them, and they have been able to get away with murder literally. So I think I still would say that I think it's important to work towards a legally binding and some sort of a verifiable measure and so forth. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop here for the time being, and let the other panelists handle most.
So if there are any comments you want.
One, I think, sir, I really liked your point about how nuclear security is one little dimension of the larger subset of nuclear issues. And the nuclear issue, I find, is quite a hydra-headed problem, because if you are not dealing with all the heads at the same time, you will have difficulties. The current sense of salience that we are attaching to nuclear weapons is also one dimension where you find countries are clamming up on disclosing anything about what their nuclear ambitions are, what their capabilities, technology development that's happening. And as a result of that, the emphasis on nuclear security also gets diluted. If military stockpiles were going to be the next issue on the agenda of looking at nuclear security, that's certainly nowhere in the picture, because nobody is interested in talking about it. You're more interested in nuclear modernization right now. The Nuclear Posture Review of the US is talking about limited nuclear wars today, an issue which we thought was settled years ago, to say that there is nothing like a limited nuclear war that is there. But if that is what the US is talking about, then how can you expect the others to, look at some of the other issues about nuclear security as well? Lack of penalty, sir, I don't think can be a reason for not living by the rules, even though I flagged that issue about lack of penalty being a lacuna in the nuclear security regime. But the fact that your security is also contingent on my actions gives you a sense of mutual vulnerability, and therefore you can't afford to take it that lightly as well. And lastly, we've all said that India also needs to keep the focus on this issue. You mentioned it in the South Asia context. I think even if we were to do an event in South Asia, but keep the context more global, is the way to approach it. And in fact, when the Nuclear Security Summit process was ending, I had thrown around this idea of the possibility of India doing the next Nuclear Security Summit. Of course, there are resources, material, human, everything that's involved in an exercise of that nature. But if we want to keep the issue alive, which I think is very much in India's interest, then perhaps the GCNEP can take a lead in doing something at a more global level in terms of keeping the focus on nuclear security.
One is that I think this is something that Allard and I, as we were developing the project, also kept talking about it. And I think the Asia focus to some extent is right, but I think if you look at the number of terrorist incidents that are happening, it's not entirely in Asia. I think the European focus is also very much becoming much more important, because the number of attacks over the last few years, whether it is in Belgium, Paris, and so on and so forth, and many of these groups have actually shown interest in procuring some sort of a nuclear or other radiological material. So I think I don't particularly like this whole big focus on Asia kind of thing. Asia is not the entire problem. I think and of course I agree with the broader point about not just terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, but also the drug mafia, the other criminal gangs could also get involved in this kind of business, and I think that's an important kind of an aspect. That's it.
Thank you. My name is Sune. I'm from the Embassy of Denmark. First of all, thank you for a great seminar and some great presentations. However, I am frankly quite surprised that after almost 2 hours, no one has mentioned North Korea. And if we've been talking about state actors and non-state actors, we've been talking about terrorism, but we've also been talking about warfare. So I think if we look at the example of North Korea and we consider prevention and punishment, I think this example shows us that it's actually quite impossible. Big actors, small actors, everyone has tried in some way to stop North Korea from developing these weapons. The ambassador told us that some of the nuclear material is unaccounted for. Maybe some of it is in North Korea. We don't know. We do know now that they have an atomic bomb. We also know that they're testing it. We've tried to stop them. Primarily Americans, have tried to punish them by economic sanctions. Now, Mr. Donald Trump, who's a charming president, has gone to Singapore. He's had a meeting with the dictator of North Korea, who then promised that they would stop some of the reactors, that they would downscale the program. Intelligence shows us that they're doing absolutely nothing. So how to punish North Korea now? And how to stop other small actors from pursuing similar means, so to speak. What I mean is, how can we seriously stop anyone else from developing these weapons when there are absolutely no punishment mechanisms that work? Thank you.
So this was my question, that we're talking about nuclear security, and we're talking about nuclear terrorism. There is something like nuclear blackmailing as well, in which I wanted to refer about North Korea. My friend has just raised this question. And second was that ambassador says that 300 tons of fissile material. This is not accounted for. It remains unaccounted for, 300 tons. And as per Dr. Raja, 25 kilogram is good enough to create a havoc. So I think in a scenario like this, if we talk about nuclear security, I do not know. Should we be talking about that also, or we first trace out that 300 tons and then we move further? Thank you.
Is my name. I want to know, have there been any serious attempts at nuclear terrorism, considering that carrying 25 kg of fissile material is not a joke, and pilfering it out of some source or some reactor or some storage is also not a joke.
I would like to continue this question by, as we were talking about that how terrorism is a little on a minimal side because of the organizational loss on that side. But what about the cases where statecraft and terrorism are combining, as in the cases of Pakistan, or as in the offensive cases of a state like Korea? And also I want to question that we all are talking about a global effort, an effort on a global level, but there is a difference between what should be and what could be done actually, because this should be part is a little I'm confused about it, because there is almost zero possibility where this nuclear power is considered as power. It has replaced the conventional military power in one sense, and it is being used as a power dynamics, especially in times like now where the world order has changed from bipolar world, and there are multiple sources of power, and thus this is being proliferated. And at the same time, there are big superpower countries uh, who have stakes in this nuclear industry, but at the same time they are bringing in some vague conventions which are a little tailor made according to their own interests. So in such a complex situations, how can we talk about getting this global consensus and not thinking about other steps which could be done? Oh, sorry. I'm Guncha. I'm a MA Peace Building and Conflict Analysis student from Jamia.
Questions. One relevant to the discussion was about, we were talking a lot about fissile material and how difficult it is for anyone to access it, and probably that kind of a bomb will only happen if there's some sort of state-sponsored effort. But we totally seem to discard the dirty bomb bit. It just had a passing mention. I don't think terrorists are looking to create large-scale urban chaos. I think they're doing more to grab attention. And if that be the case, then I think the dirty bomb is more something we should be more worried about than perhaps fissile material or creating a huge mushroom cloud. That's one part. And secondly, this is not related really to a discussion that happened, but with more and more of the revisionist, what is called the revisionist powers, investing heavily in the so-called non-revisionist states, particularly in nuclear energy, does this have the potential to destabilize in the future? Is it part of a larger strategic sort of game plan, or is it purely a commercial investment?
Okay, so
One is about this dirty bomb mentioned. It's certainly much more likely than a terrorist getting hold of a nuclear weapon. In fact, I am surprised that it hasn't happened so far, but it's not that difficult. One of the things about dirty bomb is that one doesn't know that it's dirty. There's no way of seeing the radioactive material. It has no smell, it has no taste. And what I see as the greatest danger is not somebody with a dirty bomb, but somebody who claims he has had a dirty bomb. You explode an ordinary terrorist explosion, you say this got radioactive material, that will create the kind of instability and urban chaos that you mentioned. But when I say that it's still less important, the chances are that the radioactivity actually in terms of fatalities and so on may kill a couple of dozen people, not more than that, which is bad enough. And so the damage will actually, and the explosive power has not changed at all. So it's like a conventional terrorist thing, which is not to minimize it in any way, whereas the other one is a real monster that he showed there. But I agree with you, the dirty bomb is much more likely. But the discussion of protecting radiological material is to be separated from that of protecting fissile materials, because they are completely different. The fissile materials are far more carefully guarded on one hand. They are really crown jewels of most of the countries. Radioactive materials are dispersed in all kinds of loose institutions. Nothing can be more loose than a university. So it's all over the place. So the methods that you have to use to protect radioactive material security are very different. And so not even the same set of people would be involved in that. So I think it's important to keep these two separate, but I agree the dirty bomb is more likely and should not be minimized. The other thing is a question of pilferages. Where is it likely to happen and so forth. The most dangerous time was when the Soviet Union collapsed. Because although the weapons came back to Russia, it was very quickly, the fissile materials from the others, members of the Soviet Union, did not come back that quickly. And there was concern when there were these nuclear cities of Russia where the scientists were not paid for a long time as to whether or not some of them would trickle out or be seduced out by other countries. It has been surprising that that also hasn't happened. My Russian friends tell me that that's because there's a certain kind of family solidarity amongst people who work at those places. And you can't just pull one man away. I mean, it just... So there's some other things coming into play why that has not taken place. But that was the most dangerous thing. And the non-Luger part of the story was that they pumped money into Russia so that the salaries could be paid and so forth, and people would be... So that was the most dangerous thing. As to whether pilferage has already happened, one really doesn't know. But certainly, I mean, there are people like Matt Bunn in Harvard who really believe that this is going to happen someday. I personally believe that it is unlikely because I don't think terrorists are interested in it. I mean, a few people might make some noises. Their publicity thing requires urban chaos and so forth. They may not even get universal sympathy if they were to do something as crazy as drop a nuclear weapon. So I personally think the dirty bomb is what is more likely. But of course, we have to be much more careful.
Well, let me take the North Korea question, since that seems to be exercising minds of the people. I think we have to understand one basic fact. And I think and this is at the heart of the nuclear dilemma, which is that we start with the assumption that nuclear weapons are enormously destructive, and therefore any use of nuclear weapons would be a catastrophic use. Second, if some countries consider nuclear weapons essential for their security, it is enough justification for other countries to also consider nuclear weapons justifiable. And finally, therefore, as long as nuclear weapons exist, the nuclear threat therefore will remain, and nuclear security is a subset of that threat. And so therefore, at one level, if you think about North Korea, you can say it is a completely dictatorial, totalitarian state. So by that token, nuclear security should be the tightest possible. And there is no way any terrorist should be able to get his or her hands on any fissile material in that particular country. So therefore, it is quite secure and safe. And I think we have to understand that why do we consider North Korea's nuclear weapons more dangerous than, let's say, another countries? And the reasons for that lie in the politics behind it. And in politics, you can't get into, politics, there will be differences among countries, but essentially the nuclear truth remains that as long as nuclear weapons exist, sooner or later, something or the other will give way, because that's in a sense given in the laws of probability. Finally, I think that we should also be reasonably clear that a non-state actor is unlikely to engage in nuclear terrorism. A non-state actor can only engage in nuclear terrorism if there is a state sponsor. And I think that should be quite clear. So what Allard said about weak states or things like that is, I think, the root of the problem. But once again, that again brings in the notion of politics. And that's another reason why we have had difficulties in finding stronger measures as compared to what we have today, which are voluntary and so on, in finding stronger measures to deal with a threat that we all agree is important, but the politics surrounding it make it difficult for us to get anything more meaningful done.
So, no, by its very nature, if you've heard about it, then it would have been diffused already. So the fact that one hasn't heard about it doesn't mean it's not happening.
You say doing it is very difficult, and you are carrying that fissile material, radioactive material, it cannot be hidden from anybody.
No, I'm sorry.
As they said,
Produce.
that it is state-sponsored, it cannot be.
I want to clarify one thing. Producing it cannot be hidden from anybody. But carrying a small amount can be very easily hidden.
Small amount, इधर 25 किलो कैसे ले जाओगे?
नहीं,
या 5 किलो भी कैसे ले जाओगे? The radioactivity is so intense that you need 12 feet of or 10 feet of lead wall or something.
The terrorist will be suicidal.
He's suicidal. Yeah, exactly.
Need, actually, and I believe this is more of a conclusion, is what we need is a new search and a sustained commitment in order to have all people on the same sheet of music. And as Ambassador Sood rightly said, yeah, these weak and fragile states are the weakest link. But at the end of the day, how to control terrorist organizations is how to control these weak states. And yeah, that's a political issue. And there is a positive approach and a negative approach. But how to do this, that would be not the $1 million question, but probably the $100,000 billion question. It's difficult, but because it's difficult, we can't say we can ignore it. We have to address it, and we have to continue addressing it.
I'll just ask one question. What does the dirty bomb look like? What are the ingredients? How much? Everybody talks about
Sir, that's a very useful lunch discussion. So we'll carry it over to the lunch because we are running out of time, and I'll.
It doesn't look any different. This is called a suitcase bomb. Or it can be a suitcase in
Yeah. Okay.
I think there's, okay, let me just come to the last 2 minutes to kind of wind up the discussion this morning. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and the India focus did come up, and of course the global attention. And towards that India focus and the Indian contribution, I think the fact that we will be, the Indian government will be hosting the WMD Terrorism Summit, going even beyond looking at the focusing on nuclear security alone, I think that's a good step that we will be, we look forward to more on that in the next coming days, coming months in a sense. But all that remains for me to say at this stage is thank you. I must first a big thank you to all the authors who have contributed to the essays to the volume, because all of them have remained extremely busy, maintained extremely busy schedules. Despite that, they have a prompt in writing the essays for us and participating in the workshop. And I remain thankful to all the authors and also to my co-editor who has remained very understanding and tolerant of my sort of delays and kind of things. But most of all, I want to thank the Dutch ambassador and the embassy's support and the government support to this particular project. Thank you all for coming, and the lunch is in the next room. Look forward to continuing this conversations over lunch as well. Thank you.